Book 1, Chapter 19, of Resurrection. In this state of mind, Nekhludoff left the court and went into the jurymen's room. He sat by the window smoking all the while and hearing what was being said around him. The merry merchant seemed with all his heart to sympathize with Smelkoff's way of spending his time. "There, old fellow, that was something like. Real Siberian fashion. He knew what he was about, no fear. That's the sort of wench for me." The foreman was stating his conviction that, in some way or other, the expert's conclusions were the important thing. Peter Gerasimovich was joking about something with the Jewish clerk, and they burst out laughing. Nekhludoff answered all the questions addressed to him in monosyllables and longed only to be left in peace. When the usher, with his sideways gait, called the jury back to the court, Nekhludoff was seized with fear, as if he were not going to judge, but to be judged. In the depth of his soul, he felt that he was a scoundrel who ought to be ashamed to look people in the face, yet by sheer force of habit he stepped onto the platform in his usual self-possessed manner and sat down, crossing his legs and playing with his pince-nez. The prisoners had also been led out and were now brought in again. There were some new faces in the court witnesses, and Nekhludoff noticed that Maslova could not take her eyes off a very fat woman who sat in the row in front of the grating, very showily dressed in silk and velvet, a high hat with a large bow on her head, and an elegant little reticule on her arm, which was bare to the elbow. This was, as he subsequently found out, one of the witnesses, the mistress of the establishment to which Maslova had belonged. The examination of the witnesses commenced. They were asked their names, religion, etc. Then, after some consultation as to whether the witnesses were to be sworn in or not, the old priest came in again, dragging his legs with difficulty, and again arranging the golden cross on his breast, swore the witnesses and the expert in the same quiet manner, and with the same assurance that he was doing something useful and important. The witnesses having been sworn, all but Kitaeva, the keeper of the house, were led out again. She was asked what she knew about this affair. Kitaeva nodded her head and a big hat at every sentence, and smiled affectedly. She gave a very full and intelligent account, speaking with a strong German accent. First of all, the hotel servant Simeon, whom she knew, came to her establishment on behalf of a rich Siberian merchant, and she sent Lubov back with him. After a time, Lubov returned with the merchant. The merchant was already somewhat intoxicated. She smiled as she said this, and went on drinking and treating the girls. He was short of money. He sent this same Lubov to his lodgings. He'd taken a predilection to her. She looked at the prisoner as she said this. Nekhludoff thought he saw Maslova smile here, and this seemed disgusting to him. A strange, indefinite feeling of loathing, mingled with suffering, arose in him. "And what was your opinion of Maslova?" asked the blushing and confused applicant for a judicial post, appointed to act as Maslova's advocate. "The very best," answered Kitaeva. "The young woman is educated and elegant. She was brought up in a good family and can read French. She did have a drop too much sometimes, but she never forgot herself. A very good girl." Katusha looked at the woman, then suddenly turned her eyes on the jury and fixed them on Nekhludoff, and her face grew serious and even severe. One of her serious eyes squinted, and those two strange eyes for some time gazed at Nekhludoff, who, in spite of the terrors that seized him, could not take his look off those squinting eyes with their bright clear whites. He thought of that dreadful night with its mist, the ice breaking on the river below, and when the waning moon, with horns turned upwards, that had risen towards morning, lit up something black and weird. These two black eyes now looking at him reminded him of this weird black something. She has recognized me, he thought, and Nekhludoff shrank as if expecting a blow. But she had not recognized him. She sighed quietly and again looked at the president. Nekhludoff also sighed. Oh, if it would only get on quicker, he thought. He now felt the same loathing and pity and vexation as when, out shooting, he was obliged to kill a wounded bird. The wounded bird struggles in the game bag. One is disgusted and yet feels pity, and one is in a hurry to kill the bird and forget it. Such mixed feelings filled Nekhludoff's breast as he sat listening to the examination of the witnesses. End of Book 1, Chapter 19. Book 1, Chapter 20 of Resurrection. But, as if to spite him, the case dragged out to a great length. After each witness had been examined separately, and the expert last of all, and a great number of useless questions had been put, with the usual air of importance, by the public prosecutor and by both advocates, the President invited the jury to examine the objects offered as material evidence. They consisted of an enormous diamond ring, which had evidently been worn on the first finger, and a test tube in which the poison had been analysed. These things had seals and labels attached to them. Just as the witnesses were about to look at these things, the public prosecutor rose and demanded that, before they did this, the results of the doctor's examination of the body should be read. The President, who was hurrying the business through as fast as he could in order to visit his Swiss friend, though he knew that the reading of this paper could have no other effect than that of producing weariness and putting off the dinner hour, and that the public prosecutor wanted it read simply because he knew he had a right to demand it, had no option but to express his consent. The secretary got out the doctor's report and again began to read, in his weary, lisping voice, making no distinction between the R's and L's. The external examination proved that 1. Therapont Smelkoff's height was 6 feet 5 inches. "Not so bad, that. A very good size," whispered the merchant, with interest, into Nekhludoff's ear. 2. He looked about 40 years of age. 3. The body was of a swollen appearance. 4. The flesh was of a greenish colour, with dark spots in several places. 5. The skin was raised in blisters of different sizes, and in places had come off in large pieces. 6. The hair was chestnut. It was thick and separated easily from the skin when touched. 7. The eyeballs protruded from their sockets, and the cornea had grown dim. 8. Out of the nostrils, both ears, and the mouth oozed serous liquid. The mouth was half open. 9. The neck had almost disappeared, owing to the swelling of the face and chest. And so on and so on. 4 pages were covered with the 27 paragraphs describing all the details of the external examination of the enormous, fat, swollen, and decomposing body of the merchant who had been making merry in the town. The indefinite loathing that Nekhludoff felt was increased by the description of the corpse. Katusha's life, and the scrum oozing from the nostrils of the corpse, and the eyes that protruded out of their sockets, and his own treatment of her, all seemed to belong to the same order of things, and he felt surrounded and wholly absorbed by things of the same nature. When the reading of the report of the external examination was ended, the President heaved a sigh and raised his hand, hoping it was finished, but the secretary at once went on to the description of the internal examination. The President's head again dropped into his hand, and he shut his eyes. The merchant next to Nekhludoff could hardly keep awake, and now and then his body swayed to and fro. The prisoners and the gendarmes sat perfectly quiet. The internal examination showed that 1. The skin was easily detachable from the bones of the skull, and there was no coagulated blood. 2. The bones of the skull were of average thickness and in sound condition. 3. On the membrane of the brain there were 2 discoloured spots about 4 inches long, the membrane itself being of a dull white. And so on, for 13 paragraphs more. Then followed the names and signatures of the assistants, and the doctor's conclusion, showing that the changes observed in the stomach, and to a lesser degree in the bowels and kidneys, at the post-mortem examination, and described in the official report, gave great probability to the conclusion that Smelkoff's death was caused by poison, which had entered his stomach mixed with alcohol. To decide from the state of the stomach what poison had been introduced was difficult, but it was necessary to suppose that the poison entered the stomach mixed with alcohol, since a great quantity of the latter was found in Smelkoff's stomach. "He could drink, and no mistake," again whispered the merchant, who had just woken up. The reading of this report had taken a full hour, but it had not satisfied the public prosecutor, for when it had been read through and the president turned to him saying, "I suppose it is superfluous to read the report of the examination of the internal organs," he answered in a severe tone, without looking at the president, "I shall ask to have it read." He raised himself a little, and showed by his manner that he had a right to have this report read, and would claim this right, and that if that were not granted it would serve as a cause of appeal. The member of the court with the big beard, who suffered from catarrh of the stomach, feeling quite done up, turned to the president. "What is the use of reading all this? It's only dragging it out. These new brooms do not sweep clean, they only take a long while doing it." The member with the gold spectacles said nothing, but only looked gloomily in front of him, expecting nothing good either from his wife or life in general. The reading of the report commenced. "In the year 1880, on February the 15th, I, the undersigned, commissioned by the medical department, made an examination, number 638. The secretary began again with firmness, and raising the pitch of his voice, as if to dispel the sleepiness that had overtaken all present, "In the presence of the assistant medical inspector of the internal organs, 1. The right lung and the heart, contained in a 6-pound glass jar. 2. The contents of the stomach, in a 6-pound glass jar. 3. The stomach itself, in a 6-pound glass jar. 4. The liver, the spleen, and the kidneys, in a 9-pound glass jar. 5. The intestines, in a 9-pound earthenware jar." The president here whispered to one of the members, then stooped to the other, and having received their consent, he said, "The court considers the reading of this report superfluous." The secretary stopped reading and folded the paper, and the public prosecutor angrily began to write down something. "The gentlemen of the jury may now examine the articles of material evidence," said the president. The foreman and several of the others rose and went to the table, not quite knowing what to do with their hands. They looked in turn at the glass, the test tube, and the ring. The merchant even tried on the ring. "Ah, that was a finger," he said, returning to his place. "Like a cucumber," he added. Evidently, the image he had formed in his mind of the gigantic merchant amused him. End of Book 1, Chapter 20.